Thank you everyone for joining. You are here at SCAG's final TDM training. We're doing a deep dive on TDM metrics today. So hopefully that's what you're here for and you're in the right place. We are going to do some quick introductions around the room. My name is Julia Ween. I work for STEER. And I'm joined today by John Overman from Cambridge Systematics and Ula Hester from Urban Trans North America. Really exciting presentation for you all today. Before we get started, we'd love to hear from you. So if you could use the chat function and just type in your name, your organization, and a little bit about your job title, responsibilities, particularly if it's anything related to TDM metrics. We'd love to hear about it in the chat. And I am going to turn it over to Leslie to just introduce some of the folks that we have on the call today.
Hi, Julia. It's again good to be back doing our TDM training. Looks like we have some familiar agencies. We do have folks from LA County Public Works and from some of the local cities. And right now I'm still waiting for people to be writing in the chat. So it's coming in slowly. We do have representatives again from OCTA, LADOT, LA World Airports, Cal State University San Bernardino, and let's see, we've got some people from the private sector as well, from KOA Corporation and Kittleson. So with that, I think, again, we have a great representation of some local agencies, regional agencies, and some of the private sector. And so, again, we'll keep looking for some of the names, but let's get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Leslie, and thank you everyone for joining us. And I'm realizing Leslie's photo is not up on this screen today, but just wanted to give you a quick chance to say hello. Leslie's been helping us out with all of these trainings and really appreciate her being here to do that. All right, I am actually going to turn right over to Steve Fox from SCAG just to give a quick introduction to SCAG and their approach to TDM over the past few years.
Thanks, Julia. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Steve Fox with SCAG. I'm the TDM project manager here. And for those of you not familiar with SCAG, we are a metropolitan planning organization, the largest in the United States in terms of both land area and population. We cover the 6 counties you can see on the slide, all but San Diego County. And we also have 191 cities. Next slide. Back in 2019, we adopted our first ever regional TDM strategic plan, and that was incorporated into our 2020 Regional Transportation Plan Sustainable Community Strategy we call Connect SoCal. It will also be incorporated into our next RTP-SCS in 2024 that we are just beginning work on. And notably, this document, it's on our website. If you go to SCAG programs/transportation/TDM, it's available there, as well as recordings of all the TDM training sessions we have done to date. Notably, it includes 17 specific recommendations about implementing TDM in our region in several categories: knowledge sharing, policy, partnerships, programming, and measurement. And these training sessions are one of those recommendations, as well as TDM data standards and potential regional TDM database, regional database. And that's the subject matter of today's training session. And the document also includes a list of 32 specific TDM strategies that we call our TDM toolbox. So I encourage you to take a look at that. If you have any questions, you can email me at fox@scag.ca.gov. And I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Great intro to today's training, which is particularly relevant to the SCAG TDM strategic plan. So we're very excited for that today. And as Steve mentioned, We have hosted a round of trainings here with SCAG throughout the past year. We started with sort of a round robin of each of the SCAG counties and focusing specifically on kind of an intro to TDM for each one. And then we've done a handful of deep dives into different topics specific to TDM that we heard folks might be interested in. And so this is our final training today. But the rest of the trainings, I believe, will at some point be up on the website. I don't think they're there yet, but we're recording them all and we're hoping to get them all out to you. So definitely keep in touch with us if you missed one of them and want to take a look at it in the future. We'll make sure you get to it. All right, and let's dive into our agenda today. We are going to do just a quick TDM recap. For folks who are new, I know some of you have been to a few of these trainings, and so this will be stuff you've already heard before. You can read some emails for the first 5 minutes. I'll go through it quickly. Then we're going to talk a little bit more about just introduction to TDM metrics, what they look like. We're going to talk about the logic framework and how TDM metrics fit along that line. Talk a little bit more specifically about data collection, and then a little bit about analyzing TDM data. And then we're going to turn it over. We're really excited about this to John and Ula, who are working with SCAG on their data standards project. So Steve mentioned that just a minute ago. We're going to get a really exciting update from them on what's been going on in the SCAG region and what they're planning for SCAG in the next coming years. So let's jump right into the TDM intro. And again, we start with this: why is TDM important and why can't we just all drive alone? So we all know everyone is driving alone all the time. We have lots of congestion and traffic. It's not great for our air quality, and it's really not great for our health and our well-being to be in the car all the time. So TDM really helps us address some of these issues. We want to inform travelers and we want to encourage them to use other modes. We want to encourage them to maximize the efficiency of their trips, reducing congestion and lowering vehicle emissions. We are doing that through a couple different mechanisms. We really want to reduce the need for making trips, so making it easier to do things all in one place. We want to think about consolidating trips, so maybe making a stop on your way somewhere rather than having to go in and out a few times. And then, the one that you probably typically think about with TDM, we want to be shifting trips to modes that are more efficient and more sustainable. So out of single occupancy vehicles, really into any other travel mode. TDM has a handful of different goals and benefits. Environmental is the one that we often talk about the most, thinking about reducing air quality, but there's a whole lot else that TDM supports. In terms of economic benefits, we think about the lessening reliance on freeways. It really is better for the way that we're paying for our roads and the way that our tax money is being spent. It often allows us to reduce costs of building parking, which is great for employers. And then really relevant now is thinking about TDM as an employee recruitment and retention mechanism. We know that employees are tough to come by right now, and employers are really competing. And sometimes benefits helping folks move without cars, or even just encouraging them to travel sustainably, can be a draw for new employees and a way to keep them around. I mentioned environmental benefits. Of course, they're sort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also thinking a little bit more about open space. And this goes back to this parking element and this road space element. The less space we're using for roads and parking, the more we have for green space. And then lastly here, thinking about some social benefits. The more you're moving, the happier you are, the more healthy you are typically. And again, just creating space for more livable and social communities. The more people are out on the street, taking transit together, walking, biking together, really encouraging that community more than just being in your car. So we typically bundle TDM into a couple different strategies, and you'll see these in the TDM strategic plan for SCAG if you take a look at it. We have strategies that support education and marketing, so really making sure that people understand what their options are. We talk about incentives and facilitation, and so that's really encouraging people to take other modes by either directly incentivizing them with financial incentives or gift cards or other types of benefits, or even just making it easier for folks to utilize alternative modes. So things like carpool matching programs that allow people to take that first step to change their travel habits is really helpful. We talk a little bit about infrastructure and system upgrades. So that's making sure that we have the infrastructure in place to utilize different transportation modes. So things like HOV lanes or bike racks. And then we think about parking, which is a huge contributor to the way people travel. We can use parking sometimes as sort of a stick to a carrot. You think about parking pricing or other parking strategies that encourage people to use other modes because parking might not be so readily available for them. And last bucket here is support policies, and we had a training on policy just a few weeks ago. But there are ways for public agencies in particular to really encourage and support TDM delivery at a site level or sort of a smaller agency level across the board. And so we like to see that as well. And so let's dive into TDM metrics. And first, we're just going to start with a question, and I'm hoping that folks can put some answers in the chat for me here. Can you tell us a little bit about data-driven projects that you've worked on at your agency or your organization? How have you used TDM data? And I'll pause and let folks jump in the chat here.
Yeah, so Julia, we do know that LADOT and LA County has done a lot of data type of projects. LADOT, you know, with their real-time information, they're able to, for their buses, get some data, and then generally GIS types of data have been collected throughout the city of Los Angeles, and then also LA County. So those agencies I'm aware of, and we're hoping that other people can put in the chat if they worked on a particular project that was very data driven. So right now I'm just waiting to see if maybe our folks from Burbank or Beverly Hills may have done a project recently that was data driven. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and it could be something ongoing too, if it's not a specific project, but if you're running a TDM program of any sort and you're collecting data, we'd love to know what you're collecting and how you're letting it inform what you do.
Right, we've got a few of the universities online today, and we do know that when we spoke to UC Irvine, they had talked about getting data from their recent AQMD survey, again, which helped them look at their mode split and be able to shift some of their incentives. So I think that's a great example. And right now we've just had a comment come in the chat from LAWA saying that they recently launched a TMA for all LAX employers and will be reporting on the vehicle miles traveled savings. So that again is you know, terrific. And I think actually that is a good segue into our presentation about how data really informs things, as well as reports on vehicle miles traveled and other data points. So I will hand it over to our colleagues right now.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. And thanks folks who are typing in the chat, and feel free to continue using it as I'm talking. It's always helpful for the folks who are here listening to see what everyone else is doing. But I'll keep going in the interest of time here. We're going to talk a little bit about why we collect TDM metrics or TDM data. And we like to look at it in sort of a feedback loop here. So there are 3 stages of a TDM program if we're simplifying it. You know, you launch a program, you may have sort of an initial entrance phase or a pilot phase, even if it's not formally called that. You're, you know, starting something up and seeing how it's doing. And then as the program continues, you want to continue to assess it to understand if it's working and to keep managing it. And so we really want to be collecting data at each of these stages. At the program launch, we want to identify a baseline. So as best we can, we want to understand, you know, based on our goals, how people are traveling, how far they're traveling to start. And that way we're able to assess the impact of our program at the end. As we're launching a new program or thinking about it, we want to pay really close attention to the data that's coming in, because this is the phase where we can most easily make changes to what we're doing. And so we want to understand what's working and what might not be working, so that before we continue running the program or before we launch it out to a wider audience potentially, we're able to make any pivots that we need to make. And then as the program progresses, again, we want to really be able to justify the work that we're doing. We want to be able to secure funding. We want to be able to show our higher ups that the money they're investing in this TDM program is useful and it's being spent well. And we want to be able to potentially build additional programs based on what we're doing now. And so collecting data is really important there, because we need to be able to tell that story. And we've sort of turned this into a little feedback loop here, because really the more you're able to justify the work that you're doing in your TDM programs and doing that through data, the more you're able to launch new programs, the more work you're able to do, and the more you're able to really generate this sort of cyclical support for TDM in the long term. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the types of metrics that we collect, and we're going to introduce what we call a logic chain here. And what that means is we look at 4 types of data, one being inputs, so that's really what's required to deliver the project. The next being actions, so that's what we're actually doing as part of the project. Next is outputs, and those are sort of the direct measurable elements that we can call on from the work that we're doing. And then last is our outcomes, and that's sort of our ends here, which is really the broader social value propositions that we want to achieve. So we have just kind of a quick example on the bottom here, of a Safe Routes to School program, where an input might be $50,000 and a full-time employee. What they're doing, the action is supporting the countywide Safe Routes to School program. The outputs are, hey, 50 schools are participating, and throughout those 50 schools, there are 500 students or parents who have, come to events or been engaged. Those are the things that we can measure really easily. And then what we really want to get to is the outcomes. That's thinking about these, 100 additional students that are achieving or using active modes and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. And again, remember, to understand what that 100 additional is coming from, you'll need that baseline data. And so that really brings us back to that feedback loop of wanting to collect data at the beginning and then continuously throughout any program that we're running. And just really quick here, I wanted to show how this logic chain falls among some of the other things that we sometimes look at with TDM. So we've seen these 4 elements, and really they go into the goals that we want to achieve. And so sometimes we're looking for, environmental improvement. Sometimes we're looking for goals surrounding economic development. And those are not necessarily going to be like measurable, tangible goals, but they help set up the objectives and targets that we want to set across really each of these 4 stages. And that allows us to really work backwards. So we have a really broad goal. From there, we understand what the outcomes, the measurable outcomes that we want to achieve are, and we can kind of work backwards to understand what we need to be achieving in terms of outputs and then doing in terms of actions to get there. Just a couple different examples of the types of targets or metrics that we might collect across each of these 4 stages of the chain, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. But for inputs, we're looking at things like funding, money that's going into a program, staff time, maybe materials or technology. So if you're like using a platform to, assess how folks are traveling, that would be your input. You're paying to use that platform, or you're developing a platform. The actions are the programs that we're managing, any of the administrative tasks that we need to do, any of the outreach efforts we're undertaking. So, are we pushing out newsletters? Are we attending events? Those types of things. When we move on to outputs, that's where we're really seeing the success of our actions. We're looking at program participation. We're looking at how many people were engaged. Sometimes we're even looking at how many non-SOV trips are taken. And I'll mention here that I think depending on what your goals are, and depending on how you're setting up your programs, sometimes some of these things can fall into a couple different buckets. Sometimes something might be an outcome for one program, but really an output for another program. So, for example, you can see transit ridership at the bottom of outcomes, and you can see non-SOV trips taken at the bottom of outputs. And, if you're a transit agency wanting to increase your transit ridership, then transit ridership is going to be an outcome. If you're, an agency really focusing on VMT reduction specifically, it may be that the trips that are taken, the increase in transit ridership isn't exactly the outcome. It's more of an output towards your outcome of fewer vehicles on the road and VMT reduction. So with that aside, a couple more metrics for sort of outcomes that we typically see are things like mode shift, average vehicle ridership increase. And if you attended our policy training, I think you've heard about average vehicle ridership, very commonly used in the SCAG region, but essentially looking at how many people are coming to a site versus how many vehicles. We also look at vehicle miles traveled reduction, of course, with SB 743 in California. That's something we're all really focused on. So that's often going to be an outcome for many TDM programs. And then the last one here is access or improvement, or access improvement, where maybe we're less focused on congestion reduction and we're more focused on how easy it is for folks to get places, particularly in rural communities. And we just also had a training on suburban and rural TDM programs. That's something that might be more important to them, where they don't have a lot of congestion, but they want to make it quicker or easier for folks to get around. So we're going to just dive into each of these stages of the logic chain really quickly here, just to talk about what you need to make sure you're collecting or planning to collect each of these types of data, as best you can. So thinking about inputs and actions, and again, they're likely going to be separate metrics, but require a lot of the same kind of actions on your end to collect the data correctly. So things like making sure you're keeping track of your budgets accurately, making sure you're understanding how much time is spent on tasks, and then thinking about any other in-kind support that's coming from, either your organization, your agency, or partners that you're working with. So we're going to have a quick example that we'll run through for each of the stages of the logic chain here. We're going to pretend we're doing a bike to work challenge. So employees are logging bike trips for a week. They can win prizes if they're logging their trips. And our goal really is to increase cycling to the work site. So it's, we don't have a specific target there, but we're really focused on just increasing cycling. So we're thinking about what we're putting into this program. That might look like $1,000 for prizes or giveaways for employees. It might be 100 hours of staff time who are, planning the events, pushing out all of the information, and then, attending tabling events during the challenge week. And then it might look like donated in kind from our partners that are also able to be rewards for cyclists who are participating in the program. When we're thinking about the metrics for actions, we're really looking at what we're doing. So maybe we're distributing 2 newsletters, we're posting on social media 8 times, and hey, every day of that 5-day work week, we're sitting at a table and giving out prizes and talking to cyclists and helping people understand what the event is and why we're doing it. So moving on to outputs here, really requires good data keeping in terms of who's attending your events, who's signing up for things. Sometimes that's really easy if it's something somebody has to register for, but sometimes it's just a tabling event where you're sitting there and just talking to people who walk by. And so, really encourage you here to think about sort of clickers or check marks or just nice ways to denote how many people you're talking to, because it's really helpful to just keep track of that information. Sometimes, again, there are digital records of program participation. So, today's training, we can see exactly how many people are here because it's a Zoom training and we've gotten all of your names already. And so that makes it really easy. And then last, thinking about Google Analytics, social media engagement trackers, lots of what we do on sort of the action side of our TDM programs is really pushing out information and educational materials. And so we want to understand who's engaging with it and how people are reacting to it. So again, in our bike challenge example here, an output metric might include the 100 staff that registered for the event, 500 people who, maybe they didn't all register, but they opened the newsletter, so at least they understand what's going on. And then 25 reshares on social media, so that lets us get in front of X many more people. And then last here, thinking about outcomes. And so this is often the toughest one because there aren't always really great ways to understand the data behind all of the outputs that you want to be collecting. Sometimes we use user surveys that can tell us how people have changed behavior, or how they've changed their attitudes about travel. Sometimes we use stated travel data, so things like trip tracking or trip logging, if anyone has ever used some of those platforms that allow you to log in and say how you're traveling each day, and even some of the newer platforms that do it automatically in the background so you don't have to go in and log it. Often we need calculation guidelines. So vehicle miles traveled is a really good example of this, where we likely don't know where every one of our, let's say employees, but it gets even more difficult at an agency level, are traveling to and from every day. We don't know how many miles they're traveling. So even if we know how many people have keyed into the bike room, we don't know where they're coming from necessarily. And so sometimes there's a calculation aspect to this that's required. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but there are different ways to do that. And then the last one is just thinking about metrics that might be beyond the scope of TDM programs. So things like streetlight or big data analytics, travel time reliability, some of these other metrics that agencies often are using. They're sometimes good at showing the impact of TDM programs, but I think just, it's important to note that there's often lots of different elements that are going to impact the way that those metrics appear beyond just the scope of, our TDM programs. And so while those are useful and can inform the way we collect our data, I think, it's important to make sure we're also collecting data that's more specific to the programs that we're operating. So last part of our bike challenge example here, a couple outcomes for this program could be 300 bike trips logged by participants. Again, our goal was just increasing biking in general. Looking at 30% of participants stating that they'll ride more frequently at the end of the challenge. So we're pretending at the end of the challenge, we're giving out a survey, and 30% of the people who participated said, yeah, I'll think about riding more. And then maybe we want to survey them again in 6 months to really understand how many of them are actually doing that. And, let's say 15% of participants are actually riding their bikes more. And so that's really the outcome we're trying to achieve, right? The 300 bike trips logged are great for that week, but really what we want in the long term is a, increase of folks who are doing that more regularly. And then again, an example of calculating VMT, maybe we can assume or estimate a 10% reduction in vehicle miles traveled to our site by looking at that 15% of employees who said they have been actually riding more frequently, and using an estimate or an average travel distance for all of the employees. Again, this is often easier at an employer level where you have zip codes or you can collect data about where people live. When you're looking at it at an agency level, often there's a bit more work involved in working with your economic development departments, looking at census data and other resources to understand what that average might be to be able to most accurately calculate it. And we're going to dive in a little bit to the difference between sort of user reported data and technology data. So I've talked a little bit about surveys and trip logging, and then I've talked a little bit about sort of big data. And I want to just talk a little bit more about sort of the pros and cons of both of those, because I think these are tools that you might want to consider as you are setting up, metrics collection processes for your programs. So first is user collected data. These are things like surveys, things like online trip logging. They require the users to sort of go in and say what they're doing. These are great for a couple of reasons. It makes our users think about what they're doing. It makes our travelers think about how they're actually commuting. It sometimes, depending on how our platforms or our surveys are set up, it allows folks to tell us about their unusual trips. I'll never forget a challenge that I worked on a few years ago, and there was a guy who was commuting by kayak. So you never know what you'll get, and you miss that type of thing in some of the more automated systems. So it's nice to have that. And it also, if you're setting up a survey for a small group of people, you can customize it however you want. You can get additional data about barriers or motivations that folks are often really interested in seeing, because it helps them plan the rest of their programming. But on the flip side, there's a bit less quality control. It may not be as precise, and it may incentivize users to report inaccurately. So, we tend to think fraud in the TDM incentivization gamification programs is really low, but it's always a concern that we hear from folks. If you're just telling an app how you've traveled every day to get rewards, nobody's really standing over your shoulder and telling the boss if you've lied about it. So there is obviously that possibility. On the flip side, we have more technology-aided data collection. So that's things, again, like anonymized data from Streetlight or other big data sources, traffic counts, GPS location data, and then things like the automated trip logging apps. So I mentioned Miles and Ride Amigos. Some of the platforms that we work with in the TDM world do this, where you sign in and the data is collecting your location all the time, and it can actually sense, for the most part, how you're traveling. So these are a lot easier to use in some ways because there's less manual requirements for folks. It's really just collecting data and spitting it back out, which is really nice. It often gives us more data. So in particular, when we're thinking about some of the Streetlight data type sources, we're looking at a lot of information. And so, we're able to do a lot with it. Obviously, there's time involved in that, but if you have the right people and the right amount of time, you can dive into that and figure out lots of little intricate pieces of data, which is really exciting. But on the flip side, of course, there are some privacy concerns for users, and it doesn't always capture complete trip characteristics. So again, if you're looking at like anonymized data, we don't really have a sense here of who's using our TDM programs. We're really just seeing an overall change of how people are traveling at a higher level. And then I think this is my last slide here, but I wanted to just call out the difference between sort of data analysis and predictive models. And we're not going to get too much into predictive models today, but wanted to kind of let you know that they're out there. We've been talking a lot about data analysis. So that's really the, we're collecting our data, we're looking at who's participating, and maybe we're calculating these, outcome-based metrics that we're interested in, such as mode share, average vehicle ridership, or vehicle miles traveled. There also exists what we call predictive models. So a couple of them are up on the screen here. And again, you can reach out to us if you want more information on any of them. But TRIMS, the TDM ROI calculator, and then CAPCOA, and TRIMS and the TDM ROI calculator are national, CAPCOA specifically for California. They're different tools or models that allow you to think about TDM strategies that you might want to implement and get an understanding for how successful they'll be in reducing trips and reducing vehicle miles traveled. They're basically models that have taken data from different studies around the country. They're incorporating, in some cases, local sort of metropolitan area level data in terms of understanding how people travel that can help make those calculations. And they all have slightly different uses, but they're often helpful when you're looking at either a strategy you're thinking about implementing that you haven't done yet, or a really, really large scale trying to understand or estimate your impact when you don't have the ability to survey or collect that more granular data. So again, we're not going to dive into those too much today because we really want to focus on the program level data. but it is something that exists, and we're happy to chat or answer questions about them if folks have it up at the end. And I think with that, I am going to turn it over to John, who is going to give us an introduction to SCAG's data standards project. We're very excited to hear from them today. And John, I just gave you control, so let's see if that works.
I think I have it. Thank you, Julia, and hello, everyone. It's good to see some familiar names. So I'll be talking about a project we're working with supporting on SCAG, and several of you have been involved in the TAC or have been interviewed. So some of this may be redundant for you or a recap, but excited to share what we've been up to. So as Steve mentioned earlier, both of these projects today, both the training that you're participating in, as well as the project that I'm going to talk about, were recommendations from the TDM strategic plan. So kudos to SCAG to rolling out these two projects. The knowledge sharing piece you see on the left side of the screen is the trainings themselves. The project I'm going to speak about is this recommendation to develop a regional data clearinghouse for TDM data. So we'll talk a lot about what it means to standardize data in a little bit, but the ultimate end result or goal for this project is to come up with a design or a concept for a TDM data clearinghouse. The reason that this project is really important to SCAG is because there's a lot of different TDM data being collected in the region. It's being collected in different formats, different processes for collecting the data. There's a lot of consistency, but there's a lot of inconsistency in how it's being collected and reported. And it'd be valuable to the region if there was a centralized place to store that data that can be compared across programs and across regions. So that's really the thrust of the project. The kind of key questions, the who, what, how, where, and why of the project are, understanding who's currently collecting data and what that data is. How might we standardize the data that's being collected? And I'll talk about those three questions today. The sort of next steps is what we're working on at the moment of, why might agencies be willing to share the data with SCAG? Where should the data be stored? So what would that database look like, and how might users want to interact with that database? So I'll talk a little bit about that in the next steps. I'm going to kick it over to Ula, who's going to talk a bit about the data collection overview, and then I'll come back and talk about the data standardization process.
Thanks, John. So when we started out the project, we reviewed some survey data that had been collected as part of the strategic planning process a couple of years ago, and then also conducted interviews. And I know we spoke to some of you on this call, so you'll remember that. So what we found is that data is being collected and aggregated by a number of different entities, including employers, air pollution control districts, cities with TDM ordinances, county transportation commissions, and TMAs or TMOs in the region. And the primary reason for TDM data collection in the region is compliance with trip reduction mandates. Data is also being collected to evaluate and inform TDM programs that are being implemented. But really, mandates are the driving factor for most of the data collection that is happening. So we found that there's a lot of different data being collected as well. What we focused on in this project is data that's being collected on an ongoing basis rather than for a one-off study like a traffic a transportation study that focuses on TDM. And I think Julia really explained this well earlier. We think about TDM data in three buckets. There's the inputs or actions, which is the programs implemented, outputs, the program participation, the audience is reached, and then outcomes, the average vehicle ridership, AVR, mode share, vehicle miles traveled, and such. Most of the data in the region is currently collected via surveys. We also know that some data is collected via ride matching and trip tracking platforms. And then programs implemented and program participation are also tracked often by individual agencies and sometimes also reported via either manual or via CRMs or databases. Next slide, please. So talking about regulators, driving the data collection in the region, the South Coast AQMD is probably a familiar entity to you. Their rule 2201, I think that's wrong, 2201 program is a program that impacts work sites with 250 or more employees in the region. And that region covers most of the most populated areas in the SCAG region. What that program requires is that these employers either implement an employee commute trip reduction program, and that includes annual surveying and reporting, or go with an alternative pathway. And there are two alternatives. One is paying an annual per employee fee into the air quality investment program that the South Coast AQME then uses to reduce air pollution in other ways, or into a mobile source emissions reduction credits. So those are two other ways, and they both involve paying a fee. The data collection that is happening as part of this program is via a standardized survey tool, and this has really become the de facto standard in the region for collecting mode share and average vehicle ridership data. Next slide, please. But AQMD is not the only regulator in the region that requires data collection. So we've got, the slide shows that we have different entities that currently aggregate data from employee commute surveys via regulatory requirements. And you can see the different data types that are being collected. AVR is universally tracked. Trips by mode is tracked by most agencies as well. And then trip length by some of them. But you can see that for regulators, the main focus are outcomes, not outputs. So, here it really comes down to like, are we changing the how people travel and, the metrics that are related to that. Next slide. So some of the other data that's being collected in the region relates to program implementation. And here we're looking at more of the outcome data. So data collected regarding program implementation at reach. And the examples shown here include the number of alternative data trips reported, guaranteed ride home enrollment, digital marketing statistics, et cetera. And these are typically collected by county transportation commissions and transportation management associations or organizations. I'm going to hand it back over to John.
All right, thank you, Ula. So as we were digging into this project, we started to think about how, with the end goal of developing a database or a clearinghouse, how might we organize the data? So the potential frameworks for data organization that we kicked around with the TAC are listed here. And again, I have inputs and actions. There's clearly some standardization in the sort of the logic chain that could happen as well. We talk about the line between inputs and actions, and sometimes outputs and outcomes is somewhat fuzzy, but ultimately the data that's being collected could be organized and put into a database. And so that's what we're trying to tease out is what's going on in the region, how it's being collected, how might we parse out the different elements and organize it. So you could organize a database around those sort of steps in the logic chain that Julia talked about. You could organize the database around how the data is being collected. So the commute surveys, trip tracking, the program implementation, some of the things that Ula talked about. You could also organize it around the types of data that are going to be collecting and potentially uploading it to a database. So the three different types of entities that we've talked about. Ultimately, in consultation with the TAC, it seemed to make the most sense to focus on that first line, so that you're capturing each phase of the types of different data that are being collected with that logic framework. So I will. So that's kind of where we're moving forward with under that understanding. I want to take a step back and just talk about what we mean by data standardization. So coming into the project, the goal was to develop or make recommendations for a data clearinghouse. And so sort of the individual fields, the data that how that database is structured is certainly a part of what a data standard might look like. But there are also other approaches to data standardization, and this data lifecycle highlights where those different standardization could occur. So I'll talk about these four approaches that we presented to the TAC on the next slides, but you have the data collection, which is people actually implementing TDM programs, collecting program information, collecting participation. How are they doing that data collection? Is it survey? Is it trip tracking? What are the means? What kind of terms are they using? So there's standardization that could occur at that level. The data aggregation is the piece that I've been talking the most about, where you're bringing in the data into a centralized database. So how do you sort of take data that might be in different formats and standardize it into one to fit in one database? So a couple approaches focus on data aggregation. And then finally, data processing. So Julia spoke about this, the sort of data analysis piece. How do you turn sort of a trips by mode into a VMT reduction or to mode shift? And so what kind of factors might you use to standardize the data processing that could occur inside the database or as outside of the database? So approach one that we presented to the TAC, for lack of a better term, we call it a simple data standard. So the examples here below just show inputs and outputs. Again, some of these could be called actions. But essentially, two different approaches to this could be to categorize the metrics. So, rolling up certain specific programs into more generalized categories. So do you offer an incentive type program regardless of what type of program it is? Do you have a bicycle program regardless of the specific activities within that bicycle program? So you could take everything that's happening in the region, roll it into these more generalized categories of metrics. You could also focus in on some of the key metrics. So there could be 100 different program types happening, but maybe there's a certain number of them that are really common for most TMAs or employers or programs that are implementing. So let's as a region decide on what those key metrics are and build a database around that. So there'd be few required fields and pretty simple, easy to use database. On the next slide, we presented this concept to the TAC and we got some good feedback. So on the pros, simple is obviously easier to implement. You're more likely to get participation and utilization if it's an easy to use database. It's also, you need fewer resources to massage the data, to upload the data, et cetera. The goal, just having a simple, clean simplicity could be the goal of in itself. There's certainly some cons though. So you're still going to have some manual level of effort. Might be less useful to compare across programs because the data may not be as rich, and you could oversimplify things and lose some of the nuance. And so there's definitely some pros and cons to having a more simple data standard in terms of the database. The next approach we presented was a complex data standard. Again, this would be similar to the simple database, structured similarly, but with all of the fields expanded. So the idea here would be able to capture the universe of all data that's being collected in the SCAG region, and ideally design it in a way that could collect future data that we're not aware of. So have the higher level categories be general enough to capture the universe, but then have specific options for all of the different types of inputs, outputs that are currently being collected and may be collected. So, there'd be a one-to-many relationship, right? Because some of these, there's crossover between certain programs and the inputs and outputs, and ideally kind of collapsible so that you can, if you just have information at the higher level category or the program level, you could input that information. But if you have more disaggregated information, you could enter that as well. Again, we got some good feedback on the pros and cons to this approach. Certainly world-class level TDM data, right? It could be the gold standard if you could design the database and it would be populated with a rich data set. Certainly more flexibility. The industry is changing, so certainly the flexibility to change over time would be useful. But the biggest drawback is just more labor intensive to collect and populate. So there's that fine line between having something that would be great in theory, but too difficult or too clunky to implement. You need the resources to collect the data and also to upload the data. There's some privacy concern if you have more detailed data as well. So moving on to the third approach, now we're going to go take a step back to the data collection. So when we talk about data collection, there's sort of two elements here. There's how do we define certain terms in the data collection process, and also how do we collect the data itself. So there is some discrepancy within the region and the industry around some of these definitions. How do we talk about TDM metrics? Work week, for example, is a standard Monday through Friday. Do you include weekends? There are compressed work schedules such as 980, 410. So there are different ways to talk about a compressed work week. Peak hours could be AM between 6 and 9, or it could be slightly different. Ride hailing and ride sharing are talked about different depending on the program. How do you treat? Often there's no category for a TNC or even a taxi. Electric vehicles are sometimes counted as vehicle trips. Sometimes they're counted as different depending on if you care about VMT or greenhouse gas emissions. Telework is obviously a huge thing right now with the pandemic. Mode itself, is an electric bicycle a bicycle trip? Is it something different? And finally, trips. Do you just count the longest trip? If you're gonna bike to a train, or you're gonna drive to transit, do you count both modes, or is it just the longest trip? There's also differences in how within the different types of data collection processes, how the questions that are being asked, how the data is being captured, and some of it with the trip tracking and ride matching tools. Each company has a proprietary process, but around the surveying, specifically the AQMD survey, which a lot of the different agencies replicate or use something similar, there still is some nuance and some differences in how those questions are being asked. Certainly the different programs that are being offered, TMAs and other implementers may be collecting that data differently. So there's other standardizations that we could seek around how that program activity is being tracked. So the feedback we got is, certainly having the standard collection would be very useful, and the updates are needed already. And I can talk about that in the next steps. It would be good timing to update some of the questions that are being asked. Standardization is a challenge, and this puts a lot of the onus on the implementers. And if SCAG wants to come forward and say these are the things that we should change in terms of the data collection process, that puts a lot of effort on the implementers, and those are the people out doing the programs. So it's a little bit more, I'd say, difficult to kind of change some of the data collection processes. It's more of an effort than just, say, aggregating the data. Finally, the fourth level is standardizing around the processing and calculations, the data analysis piece. So Juliet spoke about these key outcome metrics earlier, but some of the outputs, data that's being collected already, can be used to calculate some of these outcomes, but there's often missing information. So placement rates, how often do people switch to a given mode based on a program that's being implemented? So you can sometimes survey and find out that information. Sometimes you have to make assumptions. Again, that leads into vehicle trip reductions. If you switch to biking mode 1 day a week, how many trips are assumed to be reduced from your program? And then if you know the miles, the average miles per trip, or that specific trip, you can calculate VMT and VMT reduction. And then knowing that, you can calculate emissions reductions, GHG, NOx, and other criteria pollutants that you care about. So there are ways that even with imperfect information, you can come up with standard coefficients to use. So in a particular region, you might know the average commute distance, or you might know the existing mode share and certain assumptions about what kinds of programs lead to certain changes in the mode shift or the placement rates. So there are ways to sort of have standard coefficients to apply to some of the information that we collect in the database. we interviewed quite a few other agencies who have similar programs and got a couple examples here. The MWCOG, they have a very siloed program where they run a lot of the TM or a lot of the TDM programs in the Washington, D.C. region. So they have a great data that they're collecting because they're implementing these programs. And they also do a state of the commute survey. And so they have good information about sort of the baseline of travel in the region and how it's changing over time. So they can apply these coefficients pretty easily, but they've got a really somewhat sophisticated way of calculating out these outcome metrics and tracking that over time as a region. Denver Regional COG offers grants to their local agencies, and they provide a tool and a process for estimating the benefits of the grant recipients. And so they have standard default coefficients built in. You can see, average one-way trip distance here, but if a user wants to override that and add their own trip information, they can do that. But these are just a couple examples of where SCAG could look to build out standard processes and calculations to calculate those outcome metrics. Limited feedback here. I think it had been late in the meeting, so we got less feedback on this one. But I think key benefits to this is tracking things at a region over time, being able to report and say these are the TDM is doing this for the SCAG region. So and then tracking that over time. But at the same time, that's one of the drawbacks is that you'll need to update those factors as trends change. You may need to do another study to see if the coefficients still make sense. And so it'll take some level of effort to update that over time. So kind of at a high level, the guidance we got from the TAC and again, the TAC made up of representatives that we interviewed for this process. The cities with TDM ordinances, CTCs, TMAs, and the air pollution control districts. And what we heard is when looking at the different standards, they liked both the simple and the complex. Complex being sort of like better for the industry as a whole. Maybe simpler being better for the end user. Standardizing the data collections would be valuable again to the industry, but it'd needed to be done alongside the AQMD updates. So AQMD is looking at updates to their Rule 2202 and their AVR survey, and so aligning that kind of changes to data collection would be good to do an alignment with AQMD. Less interest in the approach 4. I think maybe this was because a lot of these agencies are collecting the data and aggregating the data themselves. And I'm curious to hear from you all if the sort of data processing and calculating those outcome metrics might be more useful to other users of the database. So on the last slide, I'll present just kind of a next steps on where we are. I mentioned those other tasks that we're working on. So we're doing research and interviews to understand what kind of incentives would be useful for voluntary data sharing. So looking at within the TDM industry, and this is really at the data sharing from the perspective of the agencies who are collecting the data, not necessarily incentives to utilize a TDM program. So why might some of the the cities on the call today, for example, share their data with SCAG? What kind of incentives, or how can we sort of reduce the friction for data sharing within the region? We're looking at different options for the data clearinghouse. So there are examples of other websites that host and share data, different visualizations, different user experience and user interface, ways to query and download the data. So we're exploring those different examples, and we're going to be coming back to the TAC to get feedback on some of those use cases. And really that's going to help inform the data standard development. So we're moving forward with looking at ways we can standardize the terms that are being used in the region. So actually standardizing data collection, is probably not the right time for that. That should be done alongside the AQMD update. But what are the terms that are being used that there's discrepancy in, and how might we sort of use this database as a way to start to coalesce around a common definition? We're going to be developing a more detailed data schema, again, moving towards I guess a combination of the complex and the simple database. So starting out with having a database that is clean and simple in format, but expandable to be able to accommodate some of those additional key metrics and maybe even all of the more detailed data. And so as we get into sort of the use cases, when we talk about user experience, we're going to be detailing out the database schema. Julia, do you want to take it from here?
All right. Well, really want to thank everyone for joining us today. We've come to the end of our training and our presentation. I'll share our last thank you slide. We really appreciate your time. We like to wrap these up just about 5 minutes early because we want to give you a chance to fill out our survey. Really appreciate you just taking a couple minutes of just asking, sort of what you think went well, what we could improve on, that type of thing. We'll just take you a couple minutes. TT, if you're able to post that in the chat. Oh, you did already. Excellent. So yeah, with that, we'll thank everybody for joining us today. Please do feel free to reach out to us or Steve if you have any questions or want to follow up on anything that you've heard from today's training. I know John, Ula, and I are all happy to follow up and answer questions, so don't hesitate to reach back out. And I think that is all we have for today. I hope everyone has a great rest of their day, and we'll talk to you soon.